I want to introduce Eric for our second thesis today. Eric, as many of you know, has been heavily involved in the MUN for years, and I always expected something like the military to come up, but I was shocked at some of his thesis topics early on. And in fact, he had one about the Panchasila itself, and we had to kind of stray away, but he kind of went until almost halfway through the year, I think, right, Eric, before you came up
Yes, I
with
did.
the military, which is was a little scary to me. But anyway, he's done a great job. These are Eric's words. He says, I would like to thank God for the health and opportunity to talk about this topic, Mr. Zoran and Mr. Hans for continuously guiding me through the research and structuring of this thesis, from its most rudimentary outlines to the final structure. My mom and dad for always supporting and checking on me while I work on the thesis. Mr. Wade and Miss Maymay for teaching the foundations of great rhetoric, and Mr. Christian and Mr. Tony for studying this thesis carefully and passionately, making sure to be meticulous in every single detail. And everyone else for being here today to watch this thesis defense. Eric's title is How Does an Aircraft Carrier Feed the Homeless? Indonesia's Road to Military Modernization. Give me a couple of seconds to set up the timer and I'll tell you when you can start. All right, you can start when ready.
How does an aircraft carrier feed the homeless? Why is Indonesia buying its first aircraft carrier? Why is Indonesia buying 180 new fighter jets? Are we going to war? Who's hungry? Because I know I am. I haven't eaten anything all day. But there are also people starving on the streets, struggling to find their next meal, while our government is spending trillions on buying expensive planes. Fair enough, but this thesis asks the opposite questions. What if Indonesia didn't buy its first aircraft carrier? What if Indonesia didn't buy 180 new fighter jets? Are we still preserving peace? The truth is, we can only ask these questions because nobody is holding a gun to our heads telling us that we aren't hungry. How can we help the poor, build roads for them, and create a stable economy in a country filled with rebels, terrorists, and aggressive neighbors? These questions sound like they're meant for some country in Africa or the Middle East, but they're not. This is everyday life in the villages that border rebel territory in Indonesia. The real world doesn't wait for us Indonesians. It wants to crush us in its weakest moments. Let's review our history. Since its independence, Indonesia has gone through various means of maintaining and acquiring its weapons, from salvaging colonial weapons during the post-independence era to buying second-hand weaponry from both Eastern and Western blocs during the Cold War. Negligence, however, has led Indonesia to suffering, with little suffering because of two arms embargoes, where Indonesia has made little change since those times to fulfill our minimum essential force to defend ourselves. Today, we stand with a military modernization doctrine that suits a desert better than an archipelago, public support for further funding being 6 feet under, and a military industry that is unable to build the one missing screw our jets seriously need. President Prabowo Subianto is constantly trying to renew our main weapon system called Alutsista, which encompasses anything from equipment to weapons to assets, through his Spearhead Archipelagic Trident Shield program, which costs a projected budget of 1.7 quadrillion rupiahs from now until 2045. That's about 5 years worth of MBG. Let's talk numbers. It costs 187 trillion rupiahs each year to fund our military, which only accounts for about 0.8% of GDP. While the Southeast Asian regional average of spending gross domestic product, or GDP, is 1.85%. Such a number has been limited by the public skepticism towards the Indonesian military's growth on acting like a check on its power. But what do I mean by a modern military anyway? I mean the two words that can describe it: ready and sustainable. Ready because Indonesia has the air force, the military or army, and navy to respond rapidly to foreign incursions and domestic threats as an archipelago. Sustainable because Indonesia will no longer be reliant on foreign military suppliers to supply all the weapons for it. You could pull up some adjectives to describe this military, including quick, effective, and not to mention, accountable. So the military is in deep need of modernization, but what's the big idea? Sure, Indonesia is not going to war anytime soon, at least I hope so, but Indonesia is in dire need of modernizing its military. Therefore, you guys should be asking the same questions I was asking in the beginning after this thesis is done. Exhibit A. The state-owned enterprise, East Pertamina Natuna, was conducting energy surveys on the seabed floor of the North Natuna Sea when a Chinese Coast Guard vessel halted all their operations. Mind you, this Coast Guard is 1,500 kilometers away from mainland China. That's about the distance from Bandung to Bali. Such obstruction costs Indonesia valuable economic assets, especially when talking about energy in a global energy crisis. Exhibit B. There's not just one or two of these villages that I mentioned in the beginning. There's over 100,000 internally displaced people facing the same troubles daily, where food and supply trucks are being blockaded, lights turn on a good day, and going to school might just warrant wearing a bulletproof vest. Where the dilemma rests elsewhere, note that I need to be clear. So let me be clear. This thesis should not explain the exact budgeting, outline the policy framework, nor assume the government is disciplined enough to execute any of these things, as well as it should not appeal to the nationalism of Indonesians. Rather, this thesis aims to show that the modernization of the Indonesian military is more overdue than my thesis paper was. Disclaimer, disclaimer, I do not support any injustice that the Indonesian military has conducted in the past. I am simply here to conduct a professional academic discourse on the military's current situation. Recalling that dilemma I mentioned earlier, it rests within the public and the government, where the Indonesians are faced with more troubling issues, arguably, as for example, corruption, poverty, and lack of education. However, this thesis aims to prove to the masses that modernization is necessary either way. That's why today I will bring up three arguments as to why Indonesia should modernize its military. First of all, it is modernization that leads to the protection of civilian welfare during times of peace and conflict. Second, it is economically viable for Indonesia to modernize its military, and we will gain the economic benefits as a result. And third, it is geopolitically strategic to Indonesia to modernize its military. So, for my first argument, I would like to explain how modernizing the Indonesian military protects the civilian welfare of the people here. And I will claim that Indonesia modernizing its military will protect civilians during times of peace and conflict. Thomas C. Schilling once wrote that the power to hurt, though it can usually accomplish nothing directly, is potentially a more versatile than a straightforward capacity for forcible accomplishment. What does that all mean? Schilling's idea is really simple. You wouldn't poke a grizzly bear, would you? Why not? Because the consequences of poking that bear might just outclaw you. Military deterrence is that same concept that prevents any foreign military or local terror group from committing to their malicious plans. The problem is, Indonesia is simply not present, nor does it have the assets, the logistics, and informational capacity to deter these attacks from happening, costing infrastructure and therefore our economy. It is simply put in the quote that Thesis, the Roman military author, has written before, where he said, "Therefore, whoever desires peace, let him prepare for war." This is the best simplification of how a military modernization, a modern military, can often save lives and even the world from another deadly conflict. Next thing I will claim is that supermarket workers should stay as supermarket workers. I mean that civilians who are in the current economy should stay in that economy and not have to fight. Because what if we could prevent conflict from happening at all? The protection of civilians doctrine states that our country should aim to minimize the involvement of civilians in conflict through the proper informational and military means, such as drone surveillance and civil integration. Russian and Ukrainian supermarket workers are now forced to fight on the battlefields bearing assault rifles, when, as I would argue, a modern military could prevent and deter these things from happening, from keeping these soldiers from keeping these supermarket workers on the battlefield, where keeping these workers in the supermarket and jobs alike would maintain a productive economy. Lastly, what about threats that aren't human? Of course, I mean natural disasters. Indonesia has been involved in both domestic and international disaster response managements everywhere, all the time. Here, Indonesia has accelerated, or the military has accelerated every single process from evacuation to civil infrastructure repairs to search and rescue. Abroad, our military has assisted with logistical and financial aid to Fiji, humanitarian airdrops to Gaza, and plenty of peacekeeping missions in the Middle East, which will play an important role later on. For my next argument, I will explain that we do have the money and we will gain the money from modernizing this military. So, can we do it? Yes, we can. Evidently, our military is heavily dependent, or our system is heavily dependent on foreign suppliers to fuel its needs. It's like a diabetic man who relies on some external means of dialysis to clean his blood. That external method I'm talking about is the foreign suppliers that we work with to fund, not just fund, to supply resources, equipment, and spare parts for our military, because we simply can't make it here. At the moment, most of this defense budget is a result of the budget that has been used in other government sectors and government spending, with the current defense budget being used mostly for personal pay. However, the government attempts to address this in their government development plan called Rencana Pembangunan Jangka Menengah Nasional 2025 to 2029, where it specifically states that a strong nation must have a defense and security system that, verbatim, without relying on other nations. This means that the funds will not come from the state budget, but will come from industrial collaborations and from foreign loans. Let's reference Singapore, for example. Singapore turned a marshland into a military-industrial powerhouse through public transformation and disciplined policy. So there you have it. Indonesia can get money and will gain money from doing so. But with that military-industrial powerhouse, imagine a military-grade microwave oven. Because the same people who made the magnetron for our radars also created a quick and easy way for us to heat up our food in seconds. At the moment, Indonesia's military is focused on producing tanks, planes, and warships. But who knows what Indonesia's military could achieve with a military industry as big as China or the United States one day? Who knows where we can gain all these benefits from? Not to mention, there is economic benefits to this, economic boosts we can talk about, where every time a country spends 1% more of its GDP on its military, it gains 0.7% back. Note that these benefits are not direct, because the military spending boosts the economy through every other sector, multiplying every other sector, by enhancing foreign investor confidence, available workforce, leveraging of natural resources, and government priority and policy. This way, if we leverage this domestically, Indonesia can produce industries competitive at both the national and global level in both civilian and defense sectors. If we leverage this internationally, Indonesia can gain foreign investment, increase manufacturing, and workers who know how to make world-class weapons. For my third argument, it is all about the future. A future where Indonesia's military is ready to respond to anything. Because a modern military is geopolitically strategic to Indonesia. You could call it Indonesia's charisma among international peers. Just remember the phrase, war is merely a continuation of politics by other means. Therefore, I will claim that a modern Indonesian military is essential for Indonesia's diplomatic leverage to influence international affairs in its favor. Since the beginning of its independence, Indonesia has relied on diplomacy to get what it needs, the resources it doesn't have, rather than relying on military hard power. However, that makes this argument and this whole thesis seem like a sham. But it's not, because when you think about it, what are two things that Indonesia can take away from other countries that might use it against us? Production and opportunities. Production, because our military is no longer dependent on foreign producers and foreign suppliers to supply the equipment and spare parts for our military. And opportunities, because who wouldn't want to work with a top-notch Indonesian military who can produce everything they need, from equipment to vehicles to assets that they need in Southeast Asia. But let's start with our neighbors, because a modern Indonesian military should benefit the alliances among Southeast Asian countries. Just as the saying goes, birds of a feather flock together. Countries such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Singapore all share the same natural disaster risks and cultural diversities. We especially hate it when China is always coming into our waters and stealing our fish, not to mention rare earth minerals and energy deposits. And throughout history, we have also created the Defense Industrial Collaboration, which aims to improve our industry's competitiveness in the global stage. Imagine if Indonesia were to lead this defense industry. Imagine all the contracts and all the corporations we would rake in. Lastly, I will claim one thing. Peace is Riz. Say it with me now. Peace is Riz. No, seriously. In a world where superpowers want conflict and always create conflict, us middle powers strive for a stable environment where we can grow and develop our economies. Indonesia has the potential to lead this peace building, which will earn it legitimacy among the 190 countries in the world, non-superpower countries in the world, mind you. And this is not without precedent. Indonesia has done plenty of United Nations peacekeeping operations and created buffer zones in the Middle East. And there our soldiers have learned the specialties in disaster response and especially civil integration, so that we can serve the people better than we have in Aceh, Palu, and Sumatra. Now, there are two things that people might argue against this thesis, or they will argue against this thesis. First of all, Indonesia is not currently facing any threats, and even if it were, there are more pressing priorities for us to deal with. Corruption and poverty. Two words familiar to the Indonesian public, where more than 80% of Indonesians are vulnerable to economic shock. And by the way, we only have like 1 or 2 terror attacks every decade. But this is also an appeal to ignorance to say that Indonesia has never been devastated by these threats and will never be. Indonesia cannot be reactive in times of peace when civilian lives are at stake. Essentially, poverty cannot be eradicated if infrastructure workers are being killed and threatened, if MBG events are being hijacked, and if people feel unsafe to go to work because there are so many threats around them. The second thing people will argue against this thesis is that Indonesia should stop pretending like it can build a military industry. This is not without nuance. When you think about it, why would Indonesia put farmers to work in factories? Which it can be conceded that the average Indonesian's education level is insufficient to at least work in a factory or even build an industry, as well as the industrial scale of this country. Yet, this would only be a problem if manufacturing wasn't the second biggest contributor to GDP, which shows that we already have the workforce and the technology to do so. All we need are the education policies, the technology transfers, attractive industrial policies, such as tax reductions on defense licensees, as well as the supporting infrastructure to support our military industrial powerhouse that we will build, regardless of if it takes 5 years, 10 years, or until Indonesia Emas 2045. So the question bears a new weight at the end of this paper. How does an aircraft carrier feed the homeless? What if Indonesia didn't buy a new aircraft carrier? What if Indonesia didn't modernize its military? When will Indonesians realize that we need to modernize this military to protect innocent lives and improve others? All of these questions have been answered in this thesis paper, except for the who's hungry part. Do note that we want to allow Indonesians to continue working in fields, to not bear the burden of war, working in fields that develop Indonesian economy and technology, while advancing Indonesian power worldwide. where not only can the poor be fed by the government, but can be sure that the food will arrive safely because there are no logistical challenges in a modern, interoperable military. Now, this may seem like an abstract issue to a lot of us, but there's a lot for us Indonesians to do. To the students like myself, this country needs scholars capable of learning the STEM needed to take Indonesian defense technology to the next level. As CBCS students, we are called to cultivate a love for Indonesia, where it can include anything from progressing the longevity of this country to the security of this country, which includes modernizing our military. As teachers, it is important, like Mr. Wade, it is important to show students how we have failed to modernize our military and the consequences we have suffered as a loss, for example, the loss of sovereignty we have experienced in the past. To the general Indonesian public, it is our job to elect leaders who understand the critical condition of Indonesia's military and can be held accountable for their actions. Because at the end of the day, there is no old generation, there is no new generation, there is no corrupt politician, there is no malicious military. There is only us Indonesians. Therefore, if Indonesia desires peace, let us prepare for war. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Good job. Our panelists today are Mr. Tony and Mr. Christian. We'll let Mr. Christian go first.
All right. Greetings, Eric. Oh, yeah, finish up your drinks, please.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Congratulations on your thesis. Well done on your presentation as well. As expected, as someone who has been pretty familiar with MUN affairs and presentation, your overall flair is pretty much significant. So I have to commend you on that as well. It was rather pleasing to go through your presentation already. Yeah, I'm also going to basically like commend your research as much as it is, to be honest, a rather difficult paper to go through due to the abundance of military jargons and agreements. But yes. Yeah, honestly, all that is pretty much rather fulfilling in that regard. And I can definitely see that you've done a whole lot of research as well as writing it in a way that you can emphasize the points at the end without too much confusion, right? Maybe a bit of advice as well, or well, although maybe this is like somewhat personal in that regard. You did put a little bit of banter or witty jokes in between your presentation, which is, I suppose in our setting is quite welcome. But perhaps if you were to come up or were to do a presentation to a more serious audience, it's probably best not to imitate a certain president from abroad.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Noted, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, so just out of the blue in that regard. But it is like, I think most of us can appreciate that for now. Okay. Now, I guess let's begin with the questions then, shall we?
All right.
All right. Now, of course, in your proposal here, you have emphasized that we definitely could use a modernized military in that regard. And if we're being honest, well, earlier you did mention about the boundaries of what you are trying to emphasize and not really try to solve, for example, the corruption or how to tackle it, right? But of course, inevitably, there will have to be things that at least is started in order to achieve this kind of proposal, right? So now Indonesia itself, in terms of budgeting, is currently at a bit of a strain, right? Especially with all of the programs that are happening. You have mentioned as well that our military budget is actually not enough at the moment. So in that regard, there might be some need to sacrifice other budgets that we have allocated at the moment. Do you have perhaps any ideas or like recommendations on which budget should we maybe sacrifice slightly in order to emphasize the military budget here?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Christian. And based on my research, well, there's not much I have done to explore that topic because it is kind of outside the scope. As I did explain that the military budgeting, the exact budgeting, should not be outlined in this thesis. If you would like a clear explanation, feel free to watch the recording of Rainer's thesis, who explains about how the budget can be made more efficient. Based on what he explained that the fuel subsidies could have been changed, could have an adjustment there. The MBG program could have another adjustment, and there should be more investment into other sectors. But at the moment, there is no one sector that I can emphasize on.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I suppose, yeah, that's quite a good clarification for that. Okay, let's go with the military modernization itself, right? Now, definitely you mentioned quite a lot of examples. For example, the Indonesian military buying its own set of battleship, as well as military planes and production. So can you perhaps maybe just like emphasize or clarify for all of us which sectors of the military exactly is in dire need of improvement or modernization exactly? Is it the army? Is it the training regime? Is it the industry, the weapons, or which parts exactly in that regard?
Okay, that's a very fair question because at the moment, this is something that I do need to clarify where most of our military still has its roots in the New Order era, which I can go into depth later on. But in this case, most of that history in the Suharto era has led to us having a more Java-centered military, and especially a solid army, to say the least. But our Navy and our Air Force, I, I would say, are in utter lack of any equipment. Because to put it into perspective, if you've ever seen a battleship, for example, a cruiser or destroyer, maybe those big battleships you see in the movies, yeah, funny enough, Indonesia doesn't have any of those. As an archipelago, this is sort of embarrassing, to say the least, where Indonesia can barely defend its waters, and at best it sends a cruiser, no, sorry, not a cruiser, a smaller ship to deal with, or like a corvette, to deal with any incursions in its territory. But realistically, this is going to cause a lot of problems, especially when talking about defending multiple big islands with a army and even military that's focused on defending just Java. So I would say that the Navy needs a dire improvement, not just Navy, but also the Air Force, because then we would have to cover the entire Indonesia with planes, which we are trying to do right now, but there are some problems with it.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And yeah, I suppose that also does bring up the point that the fact that again that we are a nation based on islands and big ones, right? So yeah, usually nations with that are composed of many islands tend to have a strong navy at the very least. So okay, that's quite a fair point in that regard. Yeah. Now, continuing with that, maybe let's go with the question. You did mention that well there are some aggressive neighbors that we have to take account for. That's also one of the reasons why you propose this modernization, right? And strengthening the Navy and the Air Force as well, right? Could you perhaps elaborate on examples of who they are exactly? Because so far, for most of the general people, I'm pretty sure we're not really thinking about anyone nearby that are in a threat for us, right?
That is a fair point, Mr. Christian, where at the moment there is technically no direct threat or country that wants to capture and invade Indonesia. But I will say that over time, sovereignty doesn't go away directly. It erodes, where you can begin with simply fishermen just coming to our waters and taking our fish. Like I said, China, China, China. And then it turns into Coast Guard vessels blocking and stealing our waters, our exclusive economic zones. Over time, this will take away our energy deposits and everything else. If these countries are looking to take away our resources in the waters, what's stopping them from taking away resources on land? If you want an exact name, I cannot necessarily give you any, but I will mention that our sovereignty has been stolen and robbed of us in times of, let's say, the Sipadan and Ligitan Islands, there are some islands off the coast of Kalimantan where Malaysia has been building things on it, have built a lot of tourist destinations on it, and have essentially taken away Indonesia's de facto rule over those islands. Therefore, we lost a case in the International Court of Justice on those islands. So they were legally taken away from us.
Okay, right. And emphasizing as well, you have also put about that Natuna situation in your thesis as well. And yeah, it is quite a shame that it's been continuously happening, right? But perhaps to kind of go with the further question here, right? If we're talking about what China is doing in those waters, right? Of course, they are breaching a whole lot of sovereign borders, and not just with us, but also with Philippines and many other countries around it because of, let's be honest, their greed of their for the territory,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Now, but if we really think talking about China, which is one of the main military superpowers out there, perhaps comparable to like America and similar in terms of their grit and strength, do we even stand a chance even with a modernized military? Like, for example, if the case that they finally actually took further measures or the more deliberate breaches of border.
As an individual country, Indonesia can do all these modernization measures, such as developing its weapon system, especially by acquiring new naval equipment like warships and etc., as well as the capacity to maintain air dominance through fighter jets. But in terms of the potential of what China could be with its military, could do with its military, and Indonesia is definitely far behind. Even if it were to try and catch up by 2045, that would probably not be possible. That's why in my third argument, I explicitly explain how important defense cooperation is among Southeast Asian nations, where we have worked together for a long time as a bulwark against any other outer forces. We have protected each other and we have helped each other. So we're not just opposing China alone on their foreign incursions, on their incursions to our territory. We're doing it together as ASEAN.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, we're about time. It's about time to move on to Mr. Tony.
All right, then. That concludes the
so
question from my end. Thank you.
Test. Test. Okay. Okay, Frederick, good job for your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Tony.
And as expected, you are doing such a wonderful speech with a lot of specific terms, very articulate, and memorization very well. And then I also want to compliment that you choose the Indonesia military because this is kind of rare.
Really?
I think rare, right, Mr. Strickland? It's very rare. A person want to a Chaya Bahasa student choose a topic in Indonesian military. So that is very good, yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Now, I believe hearing you and understanding Indonesian condition, everybody will agree with your thesis that Indonesia needs to do something more in its military, right? Nobody will argue whether or not we need more fund in that sector. But the real issue, I think, is whether how much is enough. That is the real question. So I would like to start with that. If, let's say, you have a way to speak to the right people and you can suggest how many percent, how many increment that you think is sufficient for 10, 20 years from now.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Tony. If we're asking how much we should, if you're asking for exact numbers on how much we should increase the budget, there are plenty of studies, I think, on my thesis paper that explain what Indonesia can do. But in terms of the exact values, I do not have those, as my research is focused on the capacity of Indonesia to do so. I'm not saying that the current budget is enough, and the current budget is enough to completely build this industry and modernize the military. But I am saying that Indonesia should have the priority and has the capacity to develop this industry through its prioritization. Where, for example, Indonesia could do industrial collaborations and take foreign loans. As expected in the government development plan, these methods of funding the modernization of military will not burden the state budget. But then these give Indonesia room to develop its military.
Yeah. Very good. Now, let's go back a little bit. I try to, perhaps I miss when I read it and when I listen to you. When we talk about modernization, military modernization, do you have any specific definition? what it look like in the military, modern military looks like?
Okay. Well, if you're asking what the government defines as a modern military, they have relied on previously they have relied on something called the minimum essential force, which means that it was a government program and policy from I believe 2019 or 2014 until 2024 to have a army, not just an army, but a navy and an air force that can prevent attacks from happening on civilians and make sure that Indonesia is safe. It doesn't necessarily state what we need, but it outlines that Indonesia should be independent of foreign suppliers, as well as it has the capacity to prevent any violations of its sovereignty. If right now, actually, we're focusing on something called the optimum essential force, which is a little bit of an upgrade, as this was created by President Prabowo, and technically he has done a rather decent job in improving our military since he was defense minister, where he has started to acquire more jets, acquire more military assets that we can use. The biggest issue is that we are still unable to maintain these assets. And the moment that nobody is able to service nor able to produce the spare parts and we can fix it, we're gone. That's the biggest issue with the military at the moment. And then again, this is rooted in Suharto's era, where he focused too much on, where I would argue that he focused heavily on infantry, focused on army, where he focused on controlling the civilians by placing battalions in every sector. Like near my house, there's actually a military base for some reason. I'm not sure why. What that's doing there. That's just an example.
Okay, very well. Now, let me ask you if, yeah, I thank you for that clarification. I remember that you mentioned that in your paper also. Now, let me continue with this. If you Google, someone could argue that Indonesia actually is a very strong nation, and the rank Indonesian military capability, even in Southeast Asia and in Asia, in the world even, we are not that far. In fact, just now I Google it, and Indonesia is the number 13 in the world.
In the world, yes.
And in our region, perhaps we are the first. We are better than Singapore. We are far better than Australia even. And this is not only one side. How you defend your arguments against that?
Thank you, Mr. Tony. When we're talking about Indonesia's military strength in a global scale, yes, it is true that we are top 13 in the world, and if I'm not mistaken, our Navy is top 4 in the world. But the problem is that at the moment, our Navy is severely lacking in the necessary criteria to defend ourselves. Because we can show we have power, we can show we have assets like warships and fighter planes, but at the end of the day, if it doesn't protect our people, it doesn't protect our islands, for example, then it doesn't matter. Because at the moment, for example, we have 4 submarines. Only have 4 submarines, with some being inactive at the moment. Submarines are essential, for example, to defending our waters, underwater, while also making sure that we have the proper information to deter attacks and to assess threats adequately. If you somehow take away these submarines and you don't protect everything else, then that's it. There is no hope of defending this country. Especially where our military modernization strategy, like we acquired an aircraft carrier and some planes, sure, which shows that puts us higher on the ranking actually, because those rankings are based on our military readiness and also the assets we have. But those rankings are not everything, because it doesn't show a deeper part of the problem with Indonesia, where we don't have first of all, the military to defend ourselves. We just have the assets, and we don't have the proper training and strategy even. We also don't have the proper industry to maintain these assets and our military.
Yeah, aligned with my question actually is, if we are quite strong in the ranking, why should we change our strategy? Why don't we keep or we improve by looking for ways to do some efficiency and so on?
Oh, okay. So the main reason why the government hasn't done much, is that a question, or why
Yeah, what
should we change?
I'm saying, you are saying that we need to pour more money, while we are already in good place. Why don't we keep and just improve within the budget? We don't need to improve any add more money into the system.
Okay, thank you for the question. Where, as I said before, these rankings, these explanations, yeah, they sure do have nuance, and they do show that our military is strong to an extent, but that's probably because we're bringing a knife to a gunfight, where our military is focused on, as I said before, it's on the army, the infantry, and not focused on defending our islands. President Prabowo actually acknowledged this, where he said that we need to focus more on our program, which is one of our strategies is called Big Island Defense, where it focuses on defending the main islands. Yes, this can work, which means it needs the proper navy to defend these islands and proper air force. However, we can take it a step further by defending the outer regions, or for example, the smaller islands outside, because then it would protect these bigger islands. And we cannot do that with soldiers. Soldiers don't have anything. They're gonna, if you bring soldiers to a naval fight, they're just gonna end up swimming in the waters while there's huge ships passing by. We don't want that to happen. We want our navy to be able to defend these islands with an air force to support them. Infantry, it defends these islands through our current doctrine, which, honestly, if I argued about doctrine, what changes we should make to doctrines, our military strategies, that is, then this paper would probably take like 40, 50 pages. Not gonna lie.
Okay.
But yeah, the idea is that our strategy at the moment needs we need some change to make sure that all Indonesians are safe and that we have sovereignty.
Okay.
Okay,
Well done.
we are actually, even though I have about 6 really good questions here, we're out of time. So you've done a great job. So what we'll do, we'll meet friends, family, panelists over here, an advisor for photos, and then we will start right at 11 with